In the spring of 2011, a college junior came up with an idea that would eventually be worth billions of dollars. His fatal mistake wasn't a bad business plan. It was assuming that his best friend wouldn't steal it from him. His name was Reggie Brown. You've almost certainly never heard of him. But he's the reason that Snapchat exists. He came up with the disappearing photo. He designed the Ghostface logo. He called it Ghostface Chilla after the Wu-Tang Clan member. He showed up every day, filed patents, called himself a co-founder, and his two fraternity brothers erased him so completely that Snap's SEC filing refers to him only as an individual. Here's the part that nobody talks about. When Brown pitched the idea to Evan Spiegel, Spiegel didn't just say yes, he brought in the third fraternity brother, Bobby Murphy. Bobby could code, the other two couldn't. And they built an app inside an LLC that Spiegel and Murphy already owned, a failed startup called Future Freshmen. Quietly renamed, quietly repurposed. Brown was contributing to a company that was never his. He didn't check the operating agreement. He didn't ask to be added to the LLC. He didn't talk to a lawyer, because Evan was his friend. Why would he need paperwork? What happened next, and what it cost him, is why Robert Greene's second law of power exists. If you want to understand the ruthless nature of power, you have to understand why friendship and business are a lethal combination. Robert Greene's second law of power is never put too much trust in friends, learn how to use enemies. Here's the psychology. When someone is your friend, your real friend, someone with whom you've shared meals and late nights and inside jokes, your threat assessment goes dark. You stop watching them the way you'd watch a stranger, and you stop focusing on the little details because you assume they're looking out for your best interests. You give them the benefit of the doubt every time, because that's what friendship is. That's what makes a friend more dangerous than an enemy. An enemy you're watching, a competitor your guard is up, but a friend has the keys to the house. They know where you're vulnerable, and by the time you realize something's wrong, they've already changed the locks. Now, on the flip side, notice Greene doesn't say, turn your enemies into friends. He says, learn how to use them. An enemy who stays your enemy can still be the most valuable person in your orbit. The tension never relaxes. They can't coast. You can't coast. Everyone performs at full voltage because nobody trusts anybody. Sometimes that electricity is worth more than any friendship. And here's the thing that makes this law so uncomfortable. It's not about paranoia. It's not about cutting people off. It's about recognizing that the warmth of a friendship can blind you to changes happening right in front of your face. The friend who would never betray you at $100 might make a very different calculation at $1,000 or $100,000 or $100 million.
And that's where you're headed. $1 billion valuation. Unless you take bad advice.
Let me show you what this looks like when someone gets it right, and then what it costs when you don't. Most people here learn how to use enemies and think it means make peace, bury the hatchet. That's not what Greene is saying. Greene is saying the enemy can stay your enemy. You just have to be smart enough to profit from the hostility. Nobody in modern history illustrates this better than Dana White and Tito Ortiz. In the late 1990s, these two were friends. White was a boxer-sized gym owner in Las Vegas who'd started managing MMA fighters on the side. Ortiz was his biggest client, UFC light heavyweight champion, the closest thing the sport had to a household name at the time. White renegotiated Ortiz's contract, got him better money, and they trained in the same gym. They were tight.
When I first became Tito's manager, the first thing I did was renegotiate his contract.
It was a battle, man. This thing lasted months. End result is, end up getting Tito a better contract.
Then, in January 2001, White's childhood friends, the Fertitta brothers, bought the UFC for $2 million and made White president. Overnight, the guy who used to work for Tito Ortiz was now his boss. And that's when it turned. Ortiz felt the new ownership wasn't paying him what he was worth.
Tito immediately felt like I was on the other side. Now I'm the devil.
He'd been champion for years. He was the biggest draw, and he thought he deserved more. He held out for more money,
I was champion for 4 years. No light heavyweight ever been a champion for 4 years. I've done a lot to the sport, and I thought I should have got some type of recognition.
After defending his title at UFC 40, he hired a new manager and started saying publicly that White had never done anything for him. White was furious. He later said he felt personally betrayed.
He comes out with his new manager and starts saying crazy shit about me, about how I never did anything for him, and I was him the whole time. Just off the charts, crazy.
This wasn't a business disagreement. This was personal. White pulled Ortiz's free tickets, removed his name from the UFC website, had him escorted out of a building. White publicly called Ortiz the dumbest person alive. Not once, not just as a joke, but as a running theme pretty much every time he came up in conversation for years.
Here's the problem with Tito. And Tito's just a really dumb human being. He's not intelligent at all. He's very, very stupid. Okay, let's start there.
Ortiz fired back, and he accused White of exploiting fighters, and tried to leverage deals with rival promotions. According to White, they got into a full-blown fistfight on a private plane flying to Japan.
We were on a private plane on our way to Japan, and Tito and I were messing around, and he put me in what's called a neck crank. And I was tapping, and he didn't stop.
So tapping means you gotta let go.
Yeah, and you can seriously hurt somebody in a neck crank, especially as big and strong as Tito is. So I just started blasting him in the ribs, started punching him in the ribs, and when he let go, just jumped up, and it was a full-blown fist fight in the plane. And we were literally taking off, and the plane was going like this, and the Fertitta brothers had to jump in and break up the fight.
It got so ugly that in 2007, they agreed to settle it with a sanctioned boxing match. White went through the athletic commission, he passed the medical tests, brought in trainers, worked out for 6 months, showed up at the weigh-in, but Ortiz didn't show. White said he absolutely would have won, and that Ortiz knew it, and that's why he pulled out. Ortiz claimed that he dropped out because the contract offered him zero pay. Either way, the president of a major sports organization, willing to get in the boxing ring with one of his own athletes, that's unprecedented. When a reporter asked Dana White to name a single favorite moment in UFC history, he didn't mention when he became president or a championship fight. He said,
When Chuck Liddell knocked Tito Ortiz out, that was my favorite moment that has ever happened in UFC history.
That was his favorite memory. And here's where Law 2 comes back. Because of all this, the hatred, the lawsuits, the public humiliation, not despite it, but because of it, Dana White never cut Tito Ortiz from the roster, and he did the opposite. You have to understand how close the UFC came to dying. By 2005, the Fertitta brothers had poured roughly $40 million into the company, and it was hemorrhaging cash. They couldn't get a TV deal. They were weeks away from shutting it down. Their last play was a reality show on Spike TV called The Ultimate Fighter. If it didn't work, the UFC was done. White needed a villain for the show, someone fans already hated, someone who would generate noise, arguments, water cooler conversation. He cast Tito Ortiz, the man he despised, the man who'd publicly accused him of exploiting fighters. The reality show that saved the company, the one that turned the UFC from a regional curiosity into a mainstream sport, was built on a rivalry that was completely, genuinely real. He booked Ortiz in main event fights against Chuck Liddell, knowing fans would pay to see either outcome. Ortiz winning meant that their villain got louder. Ortiz losing meant catharsis. UFC 66, December 2006, Liddell vs. Ortiz, the rematch. 1.05 million pay-per-view buys. 41 million in pay-per-view revenue, bigger than boxing's biggest event that year. Tito Ortiz became the UFC's biggest pay-per-view draw of 2006, the year the sport went mainstream. And at the center of nearly every major card was the man the company's president had literally fist-fought on an airplane. Even after Ortiz started losing, 4 straight defeats at one point, White kept finding reasons to bring him back. One more fight, one more card. White inducted Ortiz into the UFC Hall of Fame in 2012. The man he'd called the dumbest person alive. The man whose knockout was his favorite memory. The man he'd tried to box in the sanctioned match. Hall of Fame. Because when someone makes you that much money, history gets rewritten. Not out of forgiveness, out of accounting. White never converted Ortiz into a friend. Never tried. He understood something that Greene would appreciate. An enemy you can use is more valuable than a friend you have to manage. Ortiz had fire because he was angry. He promoted himself relentlessly because he had something to prove. Fans watched because the drama was real. The hatred wasn't a problem to solve, it was an asset to deploy. White used his enemy and built a $200 million a year. He kept the tension alive, kept the hostility running, and turned personal hatred into a business model.
Right. You know how many times Tito fought that I wanted to see him just get his ass whooped?
That's why you kept extending his contract.
Exactly.
All right, we're going to give you 3 more fights. 3 more fights.
Every time he got beat, it was absolute fun for me.
Now, let me show you the other side again. What happens when you trust your friend? Eduardo Saverin bankrolled Facebook in 2004 with roughly $1,000 in seed money.
$18,000?
Yes.
In addition to the $1,000 you'd already put up?
Yes.
A total of $19,000 now?
Yes. Hang on. I'm just checking your math on that. Yes. I got the same thing.
His best friend Mark Zuckerberg gave him a 30% stake. No formal cap table. No lawyers. 2 Harvard roommates who trusted each other. For a while it worked. Saverin was the business guy. He opened the bank account, landed the first advertising deal with a company that placed ads in college publications, and was listed as co-founder and CFO. By all appearances, a real partnership between equals. But Saverin made a mistake that Greene would have spotted immediately. He assumed the friendship was the contract. He didn't push for formal governance. He didn't demand a board seat. He didn't insist on vesting schedules or protected provisions. Why would he? Mark was his best friend.
I was your only friend.
In the summer of 2004, Zuckerberg moved to Palo Alto. Saverin stayed in New York, trying to line up advertising revenue. From Saverin's perspective, he was doing his job, building the business side while Zuckerberg built the product. From Zuckerberg's perspective, Saverin was 3,000 miles away, he wasn't contributing to the product, and he was pushing for a slower, more conservative monetization strategy that Zuckerberg thought would kill the company. Neither perspective is crazy, but only one of them had control, the corporate structure. By mid-2005, Saverin was being quietly frozen out. He was removed from the corporate bank accounts, excluded from key meetings, and then came the kill shot. New round of stock issuance that diluted his 30% stake down to roughly 5%. Here's how dilution works in practice, because most people misunderstand this. You own 30% of 100 shares, that's 30 shares. The company issues 900 new shares and gives them to everyone except you. You still have your 30 shares, nobody took them. But now there are 1,000 shares total. Your 30% just became 3%. And if they do it again and again, your shares don't disappear. They just become a rounding error in a company that keeps growing around you. You're still technically an owner, you just don't own anything that matters anymore. That's what happened to Saverin, and it wasn't theft, it was math. And math doesn't require malice. Just a board vote and a cap table, and you not watching.
You signed the papers. You set me up. You're gonna blame me because you were the business head of the company and you made a bad business deal with your own company?
Saverin sued. He settled for roughly 5%, and his name was restored as co-founder. Today he's worth about $36 billion. And his original 30%, if he had managed to hold on to it until today, that's worth around $450 billion. The friendship wasn't the poison. The friendship was the anesthetic. It numbed him to every warning sign until the surgery was over and his value had already been extracted. So let's say you're watching this and feeling the knot in your stomach. Maybe you're in business with a friend right now. Maybe you're the Reggie Brown in your story. The one who had the idea, the one doing the work, the one who hasn't checked the paperwork because it would feel weird to ask. Here are the warning signs. First, the information asymmetry creep. In the beginning, you know everything, every decision, every meeting, every email. And then slowly, so slowly you don't notice, conversations start happening without you. A meeting gets scheduled that you hear about afterward. A new hire you weren't consulted on. Each one is small enough to explain away, but the pattern is becoming the signal. If your access to information is shrinking, your position is shrinking. Second, the absence of paper. Reggie Brown never checked the operating agreement on the LLC he thought he was helping build. Saverin had a handshake deal with no protected provisions. When your friend says, "We don't need lawyers, we trust each other," that is the most dangerous sentence in business. The people who need lawyers the most are always the ones who were told that they wouldn't. The countermove is simple in theory, brutal in practice. Treat every professional relationship, especially with friends, as if it will one day be evaluated by lawyers and arbitrators. Get the equity in writing, get the role defined, get the exit terms documented. Not because you don't trust your friend, but because the version of your friend who loves you today is not the same person who will be making decisions when there's hundreds of millions of dollars on the table. You know the conversation I'm talking about, the one that feels awkward, the one where you say, "Hey, I think we should get a lawyer to write this up," and your friend looks at you like you just insulted them, like you're being paranoid, like you don't trust them. That conversation is the most important business meeting you will ever have. The fact that it feels wrong is exactly why most people skip it, and skipping it is exactly how you end up as an individual in someone else's SEC filing. And here's the flip side, the part most people skip. If you have someone in your professional life who challenges you, who disagrees with you, publicly, who makes you uncomfortable, don't rush to cut them out. Ask yourself, are they making me sharper? Dana White didn't keep Tito Ortiz around because he enjoyed his company. He kept him because the friction generated heat, and heat sold tickets and pay-per-view packages. The person who tells you what you don't want to hear, who forces you to defend your decisions, who refuses to give you the benefit of the doubt, that person might be worth more than the friend who just nods along at every meeting. Remember Reggie Brown? In August 2011, during a phone call about a patent filing, Brown and Spiegel got into a screaming match. Brown had listed the inventors as Murphy, Brown, Spiegel, putting his own name ahead of Spiegel's. Spiegel was furious. 3 years of unaired grievances exploded. The call ended when Spiegel hung up. Shortly after, Spiegel and Murphy changed the passwords and locked Brown out of everything. When Brown sued in 2013, Spiegel's lawyers described him as an unpaid intern who had been given an opportunity to earn valuable experience. The guy who conceived the product, named the company, designed the logo, and helped file the patent reduces someone who should have been grateful for the experience. He settled in 2014 for $157.5 million, more than the Winklevoss twins got from Zuckerberg, but Snapchat went public in 2017 at a $24 billion valuation and peaked at over $100 billion in early 2021. Brown's original share of the company has at various points been worth billions more than what he settled for. $157.5 million sounds like winning. It's a consolation prize. His faith in the power of friendship cost him billions. Here's the real version of this law. Never confuse friendship with function. Your friend loves you, that's real. But love doesn't show up in an operating agreement. Reggie is not listed as a co-founder in Snap's SEC filing. The document calls him an individual, and he is. An individual with a great idea, too much trust in the power of friendship, and no paperwork. Next week, there's the law that explains exactly how Spiegel pulled that off. How you make your move before anyone realizes that there's a move to make. That's Law 3. Conceal your intentions. We'll talk then. And if you enjoyed these stories, I've included links below to some really great YouTube videos that explore each more deeply, as well as a link to the audiobook for 48 Laws of Power that Robert Greene graciously put on YouTube for free. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss these next laws.